Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it's evening where I am and where Mike Sullivan is, and don't know what time it is where you will be when you're watching this, but nonetheless, welcome back. It's been a little while, Mike, since we did a little video together. Had a lot of fun before on responding to Sam Frost, Jeremiah. Uh, Now you may have to correct me. Nortier.
Yeah,
Okay.
Nortier, or
Nort-
yeah, I have the same problem.
it's a French name, and so you got to be
Right.
careful how you do that. Anyway, well, here's the situation, ladies and gentlemen. Over the last several weeks, Gary DeMar, a man that I count as a friend, by the way, and with whom I have a tremendous amount of respect. Gary and I have spoken on different conferences at different locations throughout America, and I've always enjoyed being with Gary and sharing a dais with him. Gary DeMar has made some, well, let's just say he stirred the pot a good little bit as an understatement. Uh, what Gary has done, one of the most remarkable things that he has done, is he put a parallel chart between Matthew chapter 24 and First Thessalonians chapter 4. And he wrote, if you are like me, and of course he's appealing to an awful lot of amillennialists and reformed post-millennialists, reformed guys and what have you, who would agree with him. So he says, if you're like me, you understand all of these constituent elements in Matthew 24 refer to AD 70. Well, here's First Thessalonians chapter 4 with the same identical constituent elements. So connecting the dots here and the analogia scriptura concept raises the question, are these not the same? If they're not, what's the argument to demonstrate that?
Right. What he's saying is, why is it that an all-millennialist like G.K. Beale can make these parallels and get away with it and say, yeah, and even the Reformation Study Bible says the same thing. Why is it that an all-millennialist can do that as long as they take both Matthew 24 and Thessalonians 4 and 5 as future? But if I take Matthew 24 as fulfilled and we look at the same combination, that's somehow damnable heresy.
Right.
Um, so, and there's also all this big stir because he's going to be speaking, at a Full Predators conference. But Don, he spoke at Sparta, North Carolina. I was there.
I
You
was
were
there.
speaking, Sam was speaking, and Gary DeMar was
Right.
speaking. And and even during the break, actually in your lecture, you did have those parallels. I remember
I did.
Matthew 24. But during the break, I heard Gary talking, and he talked about the apple tree and some of the problems with kind of the physical concept of resurrection. And I haven't really heard him say anything different lately than he has a few things. But I mean, overall, he has spoken at Full Predators conferences in the past. But I think that there's some people that are really stirring the pot.
No
And
question.
I think the big three would be probably Sam, Jason, and Roderick, putting pressure on guys like Gentry and so forth, and just kind of sowing some discord. But Gary's asking some very good questions. And like I was sharing with you before, it's not so important at this point that Gary becomes a full preterist. That used to be like front and center for me. Like, in every chat, I'd be pointing out all the inconsistencies and, this is, man pleasing. I don't look at it that much anymore because Gary is putting his finger on something more important, I think, and that is, as Reformed folks, are we allowed to study? Do we really believe what the Westminster Confession of Faith says? That previous creeds and confessions have been in error, and this one may be, and it is subject to the authority of the Word of God. Right. So if a better exegesis comes along, we can revise this. Do we really believe that? Number one. Do we believe in the priesthood of all believers? That's what the Reformation was all about. We don't need popes. We need the scriptures in our language. We can handle this. Do we believe in reformed and always reforming? And so I think he's kind of putting some of these people in a corner and asking some valid questions, especially when he says Gentry. What about Gentry? He takes Matthew 24:30 as AD 70, and the creeds don't say that. And then this is one I really like, and Jeremiah touched on this. And he's touched on it in the previous videos that we critiqued. God is going to judge the quick and the dead, the living and the dead. He keeps saying this. And it's like, well, Gentry believes in the time statements. 1 Peter 4:5-7, and verse 17. At the judgment, right? Definite article. It was going to be the judgment of the living and the dead that was at hand. Don, you don't know how many partial preterists I have begged, I have pleaded with them. How were the dead judged in an at-hand AD 70 time frame? Crickets, nothing. But that's what the creed says. So he's challenging people to think, and other people don't want other people to think. They just want to put people under church discipline.
Yeah.
And that's it.
I think what you've touched on there is really a whole lot of the key. It's all about authority. It's all about, and it's tradition, and obviously it's the creeds and what have you. And as I was sharing with you as we were talking before we came on air, what's happening with Gary in the Reformation circles is fairly closely parallel to what's happened in the Restoration movement, which spawned the churches of Christ, Christian Church, et cetera, et cetera. It was based upon the idea, priesthood of believers. Every man has a responsibility to study the scriptures, to make up his own mind, following good rules of hermeneutic, proper exegesis, et cetera, et cetera. And another thing, I always heard, now, of course, as you well know, Mike, in the churches of Christ, we're very, very much anti-creedal. As opposed to the Reformed circles. Of course, everyone who has a belief has a creed. That's what a creed is
or a confession,
or a confession. But in the traditional churches of Christ, in the traditional Restoration movement, that anti-creedalism was a reference to those written creeds, the councils, even going as far back as Nicaea, whatever that might be, of beliefs that were written by uninspired men that then became the law of theology. And back to Gary DeMar. Gary DeMar is, as you pointed out, saying the creeds themselves tell us to study. They tell us the scriptures are the authority. The creeds can be wrong. Even this creed can be wrong. Therefore, if it is, let's change it.
Right. Well, and go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, in the churches of Christ, we said, well, we don't have creeds, and we're willing to change. So if we're wrong, you show us where we're wrong. Well, that's just a different way of saying what the Westminster Confession of Faith said in the Reformed circles. That's all the world it is. And yet, here's Gary DeMar raising these serious, legitimate issues, exegetical, hermeneutical, Bible-based issues. And people are ready to burn him at the stake.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Restoration movement, those of us who have raised the banner of coveted eschatology, challenging the traditional amillennialism of the churches of Christ, people are ready to challenge us. I had one minister, he did not say this to me. It was reported to me by people who were there. He was teaching a class. Now, see if this doesn't sound reformed to you. Questions were raised in the class about eschatology. Now, this happened at a congregation that I preached at for 11 years. They understood coveted eschatology. Some of the people in the class were extremely well read, very, very sharp, and they were challenging the new preacher, to answer questions. And he finally said, when he couldn't answer the questions, he said, well, my position is, if we're challenged on things like this, if I don't know the answer, just fall back on the Church of Christ position and you'll be okay. That's creedalism, pure and simple.
Yeah. Tradition, yeah.
It's falling back on tradition. It's no, we don't have a written creed, but we've got a tradition. And You don't dare challenge that tradition. And if it is challenged, let's just fall back to the tradition and we'll be just fine.
Right. Well, another thing that was interesting, on his Facebook wall, once he posted Beale's chart, uh, it was interesting because people started saying, "Oh, well, that's Mike Sullivan's, thing," and it's like, wait a second, that's G.K. Beale. That's not me. That's why I quoted G.K. Beale in our book. This is their arguments. It's not our arguments. But I posted something down there because in one of Gentry's books, because he wants the man of sin to be fulfilled before AD 70, and he wants the apostasy gone so he can promote postmillennialism.
Yeah.
So Gentry is a preterist in First and Second Thessalonians. Well, I guess just that Second Thessalonians.
Yeah, Second Thessalonians 2. He's
that's it. Yeah, he won't deal with one, and he won't deal with First Thessalonians 1. So in defending that position, he says, and scholars agree that Paul's source, one of his main sources, is the Olivet Discourse. Well, Don, what you need to do is you need to go down the footnote and you need to see the scholars that he cites. And I did. I took the time, I bought the books, I looked at them, and all of them make the same parallels we do between first. I mean, now in your book, which I got an extra copy, but I think you have, if I remember right, you make several charts between First and Second Thessalonians and the Olivet Discourse.
Over 22 direct parallels.
Yes, and I was going to do the same thing without going back and looking at that. I just did First Thessalonians, all of First Thessalonians, and I got like 25. But interesting that Gentry will acknowledge that scholars are admitting this, but Gentry is so selective. It's so biased of him to push his postmillennialism. I've always said that these guys just use preterism to push their postmillennialism. I think Gentry is a classic example of that. I'm not so sure Gary is. I think Gary may still be holding on to some postmillennialism, but he's much more open. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, did you notice that Gary talked a lot about mellow on his wall lately?
Yes.
And he says, hey, contact me. I've got some good studies on the Greek word mellow. It's just translated about to be. And we were talking earlier about Gentry's recanting of his first edition before Jerusalem fell, where he was certain what mellow meant. He said, we've got to follow the literal translations, Young's literal, all these literal translations, and all these interlinears and the Greek scholars. And he knew what it meant until he came up against Romans 8 and Acts 24:15 when it came to the resurrection. And now Gentry mellow it just means will.
Or it could be certain, or it's a paraphrasis for the future, or on and on. Yeah, he decided all of a sudden that what he had written was going to completely destroy his futurism. Therefore, it can't be true.
Right.
That's essentially what Kenneth Gentry has done. But back to Gary, and what's so troublesome to Sam, he knows that when people start seeing the issues that Gary is bringing out, it is becoming more and more not only relevant, but it's becoming more and more clear to an increasing number of people that these issues are very real. And that, guess what? Those of us who are already full preterists are not the ones who invented these parallels.
Right, exactly.
It's just like you're saying, G.K. Beale, did a great job of pointing them out. Others before Beale have taken note, pardon me, of the parallels between Thessalonians and the Olivet Discourse. I was just trying to think of Plevnik, I believe was one scholar's name, who wrote during the late 40s, early 50s, in one scholarly journal, drew out a whole list of parallels. I think I quote him in my book there in regard to the parallels. So other scholars who absolutely were not preterists have seen these parallels. Gary well knew the issues that are involved at the conference in Sparta, North Carolina, that you mentioned. in which I presented those parallels in chart form in my lesson. Gary and I were out in the foyer. Now, we were all alone. I'm simply reporting this. If Gary wants to deny it and say, well, your memory is, creative or whatever, okay, but it wasn't. I know exactly what was said. And we were small talking, and finally I just asked him, I said, Gary, what do you think of my lesson? He said, well, actually, you brought up some really good points in there. He said, I must say that. But he said, you do know that Paul doesn't use the term son of man in Thessalonians, but Jesus did in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24:30. And I was like, Gary, you're not going to use that as an argument to draw a distinction between the two passages, are you? And he goes, that wouldn't be a very good argument, would it? And I said, no, no, it wouldn't. There was absolutely no rancor, no animosity between us. He understood the issues. I understood the issues. So we went back in and listened to some other presentations. So Gary is known for a good long while. He probably knew before he ever heard my lesson.
Right. Oh, I believe he did. I mean, because these have been brought up. I mean, once you no longer divide the Olivet Discourse, I mean, it just opens up a whole new world, a whole set of problems if you're still going to be a futurist. And I think he knows. And speaking of that issue, maybe it's a good segue into Kim Burgess, who is Gary's friend.
Yes.
And this is who Sam and Jeremiah are critiquing. They're critiquing Gary DeMar as he's giving these podcasts with his friend who is Kim, and he graduated RTS with Gary. And it seems as if I don't want to definitely be guilty of misrepresenting anyone, but from what I've heard so far of the two podcasts, and I guess there's going to be some more podcasts, how would I say this? It seems to me that Kim is kind of, he says he's a full preterist, kind of, sort of, but he wants some nuance.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, well, I'm a consistent preterist. And then he kind of attacks full preterism on some issues. But it seems to me that he's kind of marrying some post-millennialism with full preterism. So he believes the 1 second coming was fulfilled in AD 70. He believes there's a spiritual resurrection, from what I understand, in AD 70. But there's still maybe this kind of end of world history. So, Sam's big thing is, baby rape is going to continue for, just this emotional.
Yes, I know.
So I don't see that. I don't see anywhere where scripture talks about the end of world history, but I think he might believe, he's got a few texts that teach that. But I think that's kind of where, and he's kind of held to this since about 1985, from what I understand. So
yes,
he's held to this for a very long time. And it's different than, say, Milton Terry, James Stewart Russell, or even Mike Bull, right? Where they have this, we're still in the millennium. What ends it, we don't know, because they've already surrendered all the second coming passages. But they would still say there's a physical resurrection. Whereas now Kim believes all these events were fulfilled in AD 70, but he's still holding to the end of world history. And my question is, well, what ends that? The gospel, leavens the whole world in this kind of post-millennial thing, I think. But
I wish that I could answer that for you. Kim and I have been corresponding for, I suppose, ever since I started producing my YouTube videos. Shortly after I began, he started private messaging me, critiquing my videos, mostly in a very positive way. And Kim is a well-read guy.
Yeah.
He doesn't communicate, how do I put this, tactfully. He has come across as, and if he ever watches this, I certainly don't want to offend him in any way, but he very often comes across as, you're nothing but a dummy here. Let me instruct you.
Right.
And I'm going to teach you what you're missing, and I'm going to show you the way. And so we butted heads.
Right.
on some
We've
issues.
got two type A personalities here.
Bingo.
That's probably not going to go anywhere fast. I got
Yeah.
you.
So, at times I have chosen to just basically ignore him for a while. And then I go back to corresponding and what have you, because I've even told him once in a while he's coming across as far too abrasive, and a little bit high on the hog here. So, a
Right.
little bit oh, intellectual sophistry, maybe. And so he needs to back off. You know, I try to be a person that's more than willing to change with constructive criticism. I am a type A personality. So when somebody comes at me with guns blazing and
Right. Right.
and says I'm more ignorant than dirt, basically, I, yeah, I don't take to that real well.
Right.
Um, I may slow down, I may back up and think about it afterwards and say, well, maybe there was merit to that after all. But when somebody comes at me like that, then I have a tendency to I'm going to push back a little bit. But
Right.
he's an awfully nice guy. Uh, Again, he's very sharp. I have certainly disagreed with his concepts of a new creation at some point in our future. Some kind of a literalistic, as I understood him to be promoting. I just told him I just don't see that in Romans 8. Uh, I think I've explained my reasons why in my videos. So he and I,
He may have changed his view on that. I don't know, but I know he knows Mello
oh,
is in
certainly does.
Romans 8. So I think he just believes in the end of world history. He's got a couple passages that he thinks teaches that, along with maybe some Old Testament passages, the typical, post millennial, which I believe is just kind of hyperbole, but they take it really hyper literally. But every king and every nation is
Right,
gonna
exactly. Yes.
be
Okay,
Christianized.
why don't we get back and let's take a look at some of the things. There's an awful lot that we could cover,
Yeah.
and you and I were talking about it before we came on the air. So much of what Sam did, and we're not the only ones to notice this. We're not the only ones to make comment on it. But so much of what Sam did was literally just rambling.
Yeah.
He would just start talking, and I would find myself, and I know Jeremiah obviously did from the way he kept trying to bring him
Right.
back, bring him back, bring him back,
Right.
is Sam would just go off. He'd just start talking and about this and about that and about all the scholars that he's talked to and some in foreign countries, and everybody agrees on this and that and the other. And, sorry, that doesn't necessarily impress me, especially when you're not offering any exegesis and you're
Right.
not offering exegesis from those scholars. All you're doing is telling me, well, they've got their opinion and I agree with their opinion. Okay, that's
Right.
fine. Uh, so one of the things that he made a big issue of, and I'm going to skip over some things that I took notes about, uh, including the fact that Gary DeMar says that we die and we go to heaven and we get a body, uh, a
Spiritual
heavenly
body.
body.
Mm-hmm.
Frost said that's just absolute nonsense, and that flies in the face of some of Frost's positions.
Well,
I'll just make mention of this very quickly. I have in my files, in my folders, conversation between myself and Sam Frost on Facebook. And if anybody wants me to verify this with the actual copy and paste, I'll be more than happy to do that. But the point of fact is, Sam Frost has a position of three bodies. If the earthly house of this tabernacle, that's our physical body, according to Sam Frost. So the tabernacle is a body, right? If our earthly house of this tabernacle be dissolved, just like Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 14. I know that I must shortly put off this tabernacle. Well,
right.
he wasn't talking about carrying around some kind of a goat hair tent. He was talking about a physical body. So if our earthly house of this tabernacle be dissolved, that is physical body. We have a house of God, eternal in the heavens, a house of God not made with hands, eternal in the heavens.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I pointed out that in the grammatical and the syntactical flow of that verse, that tabernacle in the heavens has to be a body. If the first tabernacle is a body, then the second tabernacle is a body. That means if Paul's talking about biological bodies, if Paul's not talking about old covenant world, new covenant world, old covenant tabernacle, new covenant tabernacle, which I believe he's talking in corporate terms. I don't believe he's talking about the physical body at all. But taking their view of this, okay, taking Sam's definition of if our earthly house of this tabernacle is dissolved, physical body, okay, taking Sam's view, then we have an earthly physical tabernacle, which is the human body. We have a heavenly tabernacle, which has to be a body. And then at the end of time, we leave heaven. We put off that heavenly tabernacle, which is eternal, by the way.
Right.
That's what Paul says. We come back to earth to get this physical body that's been completely dissolved, scattered to the wind, eaten by the fishes, whatever. It's put back together, so we get a third body. It's the same body but reconstituted, but it's nonetheless a third body. He came unglued on Facebook when I pointed that out. He says, I have never, ever, ever said that we have a body in heaven. Well, like I said, the syntactical and grammatical flow of that text is, if the earthly house and if the earthly tabernacle, and it is skinus in the Greek, which is tabernacle, and we have a house, oikos. So we have house and we have tabernacle. If this is dissolved, we have a building, oikonomia or oikos, eternal in the heavens, a tabernacle. Two tabernacles. One's a body. Two houses. One's a body. Earth or heavenly temple, tabernacle, heavenly house.
Right.
Why isn't that second one a body? The body, which again, if we're talking about physical, biological bodies and human bodies and things, then Gary DeMar is absolutely perfectly correct based on 2 Corinthians 5. But Sam Frost says that is nonsense. That's what he called it on the tape.
Right. And it's interesting because in our book, when David Green is interacting with Robert Strimple, he points out that Strimple, when he's debating premillennialists in Revelation 20, he has taken the position in the past that there is a resurrection. When someone dies, their spirit is raised from their body and has a spiritual body. So what Gary is saying is not, and even if you read G.K. Beale in Revelation chapter 20, it's been a long time since I read it, but I think he shows how some people believe this. So it's not like, it just came out of nowhere, like Gary's just making something up. I mean, Robert Strimple's very well known in the Reformed community. And this concept, Don, that there's no resurrection unless the body is I mean, we're reformed. I'm reformed, and Ephesians 2, Colossians 2. When someone believes, they're raised. John 5. At least the first part they would admit is a spiritual regeneration, resurrection. And when we are transferred from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light, there's a transfer of places, of realms, of positions, and that is a resurrection. That is a spiritual resurrection. So why can't there be a spiritual resurrection from the realm of the dead, Hades or Abraham's bosom, who their souls were still enslaved to the death, and when the death was conquered, they're raised from the death and that realm to God's presence to inherit eternal life. So the same concept can apply. You don't have to have a physical body to have the resurrection. It's just
some of the earliest of the patristic writers they border on being apostolic. Ignatius, writing in approximately 115 to 117 AD, that's really close. Ignatius taught that being delivered out of Hades into heaven as a result of the work of Christ was resurrection.
Well, there you have it.
I mean, this is Ignatius, for crying out loud.
So he just didn't have the right event.
That's exactly right.
Did he place it at the ascension of Christ or something?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Which he's even anachronistic in that, because he talks about the apostles being raised out of Hades and going to heaven. And you're going, but that wasn't at the cross, and it wasn't at Jesus's resurrection, and it wasn't at the ascension. I'm sorry.
He just doesn't place it where Scripture places it, but
exactly
he sees
right.
that it's a resurrection.
He saw, and look, this is a relatively, common view in the patristic writers. There is an Eastern Orthodox rabbi. Please, I'm sorry, can't remember his name, but it is Christ the Conqueror of Hell. This guy, a scholar, documents that the dominant view in the earliest of the patristics, the dominant view, 3rd, 4th century, was Hades was a place of consciousness. Sam Frost now takes the position there is no such thing as Hades. It's just simply the grave. It's the dirt. It's the sepulcher of blah, blah, blah.
No, they believe that Christ went and preached during those 3 days. I mean, the early church fathers.
Oh, yeah. And that's what I'm saying. This Eastern Orthodox priest does that. And he talks about how Christ, through the power of the cross, and they don't get the timing or the position right, but they nonetheless talk about taken out of Hades into heaven. Well, Sam Frost says, well, I stand with the early church writers. I'm a believer in church history. He categorically stands in opposition to the majority of the early church writers in regard to Hades and being taken out of Hades, taken into heaven. And furthermore, what you pointed out there a moment ago is absolutely correct. In Ephesians chapter 1 and Ephesians chapter 2, Paul uses the word egeiro, raised us. And Paul had a prayer for the Ephesians. He said that it was his prayer that the eyes of their enlightenment would be opened, that they might come to comprehend with all of the saints what is the glory and the power of the inheritance among the saints, and to know the exceeding power of God when he raised up Christ, egeiro. That's the physical resurrection of Christ. Okay. When he raised him up from the dead, seated him at his right hand in the heavenlies, gave him a name above every name that is named both in this age and in the age to come. Well, guess what? In Ephesians chapter 2, you who once dead in your sins and your trespasses, has he raised you up together, egeiro. Same. And he said they were dead. So here is Christ, who is raised from the dead. Here are the Ephesians who were raised from their sin. So when it is argued that resurrection can only be biological bodies coming out of graves, that's not a very solid linguistic argument at all.
Right.
That word egeiro is used very commonly for the concept of resurrection.
Absolutely.
And of course, Sam wants to ignore all of that in his insistence on biological death and biological resurrection. But this whole concept here of DeMar and the position that he's now taking, when Sam Frost says, well, that's just nonsense, Sam Frost is not standing with the early church on this.
No, he's not.
It's just another example of where he likes to get on these blogs and talk about how all scholars agree when all scholars don't agree.
Right.
A whole bunch of historical and modern academics totally disagree with him. Now, can he say, well, they all agree the coming of the Lord is still future? Well, yeah, they might. But the other things that they write falsifies their own views, as you well know, and both of us have documented in our writings. So anyway, I want to get to one more item, then let's get into the issue of the end of the age, because it was more than obvious to me that Jeremiah really, really, really wanted to get something to help him out with Gary DeMar's view on the end of the age, because Gary DeMar has a pretty good grasp on an awful lot of it. But one of the points that I wanted to take note of, Sam Frost, as usual, goes into this almost a tirade of insistence, the vehement insistence that Christ is still in his incarnate form. Yeah. So he goes 1 John chapter 4, 2 and 3. This is those who are of God, those who confess that Christ has come in the flesh. Well, has come is in the perfect tense. It's in the perfect participial form. Those who say that Christ has not come, perfect participle, in the flesh, are not of God. And this is that spirit of Antichrist, which you heard was coming and is even now in the world. Verse 5. So anyway, Sam argues, and he said, look, has come. If you are of God, then you agree that Christ has come. Perfect tense. Those who are not of God deny that Christ has come. That's perfect tense. So that means, according to Sam Frost, since Christ was manifested in the flesh, he must still be in the flesh. Right. Now, we both know that he says, oh, it's transformed. But wait a minute. That's abusing the Greek, because the perfect tense means as he came, so is he. Let's see how that works out. How was Christ manifested in the flesh? Well, he was manifested in mortal flesh. Now remember, the perfect tense, Sam Frost says, means as he was manifested, so is he now. That's what he constantly harps on.
Right.
So the Bible teaches us he was manifested in mortal flesh. Sam doesn't believe he is now in mortal flesh. Well, then there goes your argument for the present tense, or perfect tense, excuse me. Christ was made a little lower than the angels. Is he now a little lower than the angels? Well, according to Ephesians 1, the passage I cited a moment ago, he's been given a name above every name, both in this age and in the age to come. Hebrews chapter 2. He has not put the age to come of which we speak subject to angels, but to the Son, he says, thou art my son. So Christ was made a little lower than the angels. Is he still that way based upon the perfect tense? Christ was manifested, let's see, in our vile body.
Yeah.
To use Philippians 3 in a good old King James. That was how he's manifested originally. And again, to reiterate, Sam Frost says, as he was manifested, so is he now. Now, it won't do Sam any good to come back and say, well, everybody knows that I teach, and the Bible teaches that Christ was transformed. Okay, Sam, that destroys your argument on the perfect tense. What you are arguing is, as he was manifested, so is he now. That's the force of the perfect tense. You tell us. That's what you argued in this video. Well, there are other things that we could take note of as he was manifested. You know, when the apostles were with him, for instance, they knew what he was like, right? They ate with him, they walked with him, they talked with him. They saw everything about him there was to know about a human being named Jesus of Nazareth. But John said in 1 John chapter 3, brethren, we do not know what we shall be, but we be like him when he comes. They knew what he was. They did not know what he is. Well, there goes the argument right up in smoke that says the perfect tense demands as he was, so he is. So I just thought it necessary to point out that Sam likes to come across as this great Greek scholar, constantly telling us, I've been reading the Greek now for 35 years. Well, just because you've read the Greek and read the Greek, and hey, I appreciate people who can read the Greek. I really honestly do. So I used to have friends, he could pick up a Greek text without an interlinear, man, mind you, and read it better than I can read English. And he knew exactly what it said. He was a professor of Greek and professor of Hebrew at what used to be called Oklahoma Christian College years ago. He's passed away. But the point of fact is, just because you can read the Greek doesn't mean that you're interpreting it properly.
Right.
And that's
well, I remember I remember when Sam first started this, Dorothy, who was a good friend of David Green and myself, she was good friends with, or I don't want to say good friends, but she was friends with D.A. Carson. And so she sent him this Sam's argument in the Greek. And D.A. Carson is a futurist, believes Jesus has a physical body, believes Jesus is going to come back in a physical body. But he said, no, this Greek argument doesn't stand. It's not strong at all. And so, when you even have futurists that want to believe this, right. But just have to say, no, this Sam is so desperate, he will find anything from anywhere, whether it's liberal. I mean, he will change his view 5,000 times. He will manipulate. He'll do anything he can to try and discredit full preterism. I don't understand how people just can't see the bias at this point, especially that last article where he tried to do away with imminence. It was just like, anyway.
That was literally a sham. It was an abuse of scholarship. It was an abuse of language. It's really, and I honestly believe, I said this to a friend of mine just the other day, who has known Sam and known his writings, and he sees where Sam is right now. And I said, I believe truly that more and more people are catching on to Sam's sham arguments.
Yeah.
The shallow nature and the illogical nature of his arguments, and how Sam changes his views seemingly from week to week.
Yeah.
I mean,
like you said, four different views of Daniel chapter 12.
Exactly.
He's changed his eschatological position 6 or 7 times completely.
Yes.
How that it's just not a stable person, or has any kind of credibility in my mind. But and that's one of the reasons why I've never really wanted to debate him, for many reasons. But that's the main one, is I would write articles refuting something he said, and then a couple of weeks later the article's gone, or he's changed his view on it, and it's like, I'm not going to put in the time to create arguments and stuff when this guy keeps changing his views all the time.
Yeah, one of the problems with that type of a situation is when you get into, one thing I just absolutely abhor is being misrepresented, and I hate to misrepresent people.
Right.
And of course, Sam has accused me repeatedly of misrepresenting him when I had the quote that he had given. I copied and pasted it. And then, like you say, well, that's not my position now. Well, how was I to know that?
Exactly.
And so it is very, very frustrating. Okay, let's get
into the age.
Yes, sir. As we stated a few moments ago, Jeremiah asked him about Gary DeMar's position on the end of the age, what he understood Gary to be saying. Well, Gary DeMar seems to be understanding. You can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but Gary DeMar certainly seems to be thinking, seeing, and understanding now that when the apostles asked about the end of the age in Matthew chapter 24, they were not asking about the end of time. They were not asking about the end of human history. They understood that there was a linkage between the fall of the temple and the end of the age. Now,
absolutely. Sam, he's been teaching this for a long time. David Chilton was teaching this before he became a full preterist. Milton Terry. I mean, the list goes on. There's and Sam kind of poo-pooed, like, well, there are some preterists that might teach this, but the vast majority of scholars. No, there's a lot of, very scholarly partial preterists that take this position.
Well, yeah, that's part of my problem, of many problems that I have with Sam Frost on the Olivet Discourse. You and I were talking about it before we come on the air. His attempt to explain the Olivet Discourse on Jeremiah's program
Hmm.
Well, you just sit and you go, where in the world did this stuff come from?
Right.
It is not textual. He claims it's textual because he says it's textual.
Right.
And that's the only evidence really that he gives. So here's the question. And here's where I find I have a lot of problems with what Sam tries to do. This gets back to his constant vacillations. In early correspondence with Sam on Facebook over the last 2 years, I pointed out that the apostles very clearly associated the end of the age with the fall of the temple, destruction of the temple. Sam Frost responded by saying the apostles absolutely were not thinking of the end of the age. They had no concept of the end of the age at all, period, end of story. I go, wow, that's certainly not a scholarly consensus view. By any stretch of the imagination, you pick up virtually any commentary and they will tell you, yeah, the apostles had the end of the age in mind. Now, they may disagree as to what the end of what age,
Right.
but they all agree the apostles linked to follow Jerusalem with the end of the age.
Mm-hmm.
Very shortly after that, in the midst of our debate on Facebook, Sam Frost posted, it was perfectly natural for the apostles to believe that the destruction of Jerusalem would be at the end of the age. So he went from denying categorically, vehemently, that the apostles had any concept of the end of the age and linking it with the destruction to going, oh, it was perfectly natural. That was his term, perfectly natural for the apostles to link it with at the end of the age with the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, when Sam Frost talks about the end of the age in Matthew 24 in this program with Jeremiah, he admitted that there was one question.
Right.
Well, to me, that's kind of a fatal admission. But then he
I
tried to worm himself out of that fatal admission. But for anyone who is paying attention, once you admit that the apostles had one thing in mind, these things, all of these things, destruction of the temple, linked with Christ's parousia, linked with the end of the age, then you've only got one position or a couple of choices to make. Number one, they were right to make that association, or number two, they were wrong.
Right.
And as you know, I wrote a book, Watching for the Parousia, where Jesus' apostles confused. And I take note of the fact that there is a consensus among scholars that the apostles, point number one, did link the destruction of the temple with the end of the age. Point number two, they were wrong. They were confused. They were ignorant. Now, this is Kenneth Gentry's position in spades.
Right.
You know, Kenneth Gentry has always really liked to ignore my books, even though I knew for a fact that he had them.
Right.
But nonetheless, when I published that book and it came out, Gentry wrote 4 articles just blasting my book. And so naturally I wrote responses to him, and he hadn't said a word since. Now, pardon me, Kenneth did say that he had found a fatal flaw in my argument. He couldn't believe how powerful the argument is, and he's going to reveal it at a future time. And I posted in my article, Ken, why wait?
Right.
Why wait for people perhaps to be convinced by my arguments? Why not post your devastating argument to prevent people from being confused? No. I'll reveal this at a later time.
Yeah.
So here's what.
Well,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
No, that's all right. Go ahead.
I was just going to say briefly, Ken says that the disciples were confused in connecting the two. And then he says, to prove this, he says, well, there's 7 different times in the Gospels where the disciples are confused.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a classic case of proving too much, because when we go to those 7 passages, either Matthew as the narrator or Jesus as the instructor clearly tells you that they were confused. The text is really clear that they were
Oh,
confused.
absolutely.
So if that's the standard, when we come here to Matthew 24, we should see that. And we don't see Matthew showing us that. We don't see Jesus showing us that. So it proves too much. The other issue is, there was this big deal about oikumene in Matthew 24:14. And that's just no way that could be fulfilled in AD 70, even though Gentry teaches that.
Right.
And so what is the end? The gospel must be preached in all the world, and then the end. Contextually, this is like hermeneutics 101, Don. Anyone
Absolutely.
knows.
Absolutely.
You ask, well, isn't that the end that the disciples just asked about? And Gentry calls that the end of the Jewish age, Matthew 20, that end. It's just like he just can't, he won't connect the dots because he knows where it's going.
Well, that's absolutely true. And Jeremiah very clearly sees the train coming, it seems to me. Right. I don't want to be unfair to Jeremiah, but Jeremiah admitted that there's an awful lot of validity to the concept of the coming dissolution, the coming end of the old covenant order. Sam wouldn't touch that. Sam never addressed that. Right. At least I don't remember him doing that. And here is a little bit of Jewish historical fact. The Jews had a concept of two ages, what they called this age and the age to come. They believed that this age would come to an end at the time of the resurrection, the judgment, and the coming of the Messiah. They believed that the age to come, which is the age of the Messiah, the new covenant, the kingdom, resurrection life, eternal life, all of those really wonderful things that we enjoy today, that would never end. And yet here's Sam Frost and Jeremiah saying, well, the idea that the apostles were thinking about the end of the age is a silly idea. Really? Wait a minute. What had Jesus just predicted? The dissolution of the temple. And Jeremiah took note of the fact, and Sam did too, that when Jesus predicted the casting down of the stones, not one stone shall be left standing on another, Sam goes off and he says to the mind of the Jew, of those apostles, that was devastating, because how could such a marvelous, incredible edifice ever be destroyed? Well, at the coming of the Lord, the judgment, resurrection, at the end of the age, it would be destroyed, which is precisely what the Jews believed.
Yeah, Daniel 9, Malachi 3 and 4, Daniel 12. I mean, that's why, because they knew their Old Testament scriptures, and they knew what Jesus was teaching about his coming and about the end, even Matthew 10, 22 and 23. He who, perseveres until the end, connecting that with his coming and the gospel being preached. So, they knew what the end was. They knew that the destruction of the temple was connected to that teleos, that end. And Sam was correct. I mean, he went to Daniel 12. He says, well, the end of the age that Jesus is talking about, Matthew 13, Matthew 24, and Matthew 28, that is the end of Daniel 12. But Don, we've done 2 or 3 videos critiquing these guys. They do not want to deal with Daniel 12:7 at all.
No. Of course, this is another example of where Sam has changed his views. Early on, Sam admitted, I have it in my files, Sam admitted that the destruction of the power of the holy people was in fact the attack on the Jews. Now, he says it refers to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, but I'm sorry, that won't work.
Right.
Matter of fact, I just posted an article on my website yesterday. It is Antiochus Epiphanes and the Great Tribulation, because Sam Frost takes the position that Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, and at that time, Michael shall stand up for your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as has never been since there was a nation, even until that time. Sam Frost says that's the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, I'm sorry. The time of Antiochus Epiphanes was not, by any stretch of the imagination, the Great Tribulation. Greater greater than anything that had ever happened since there was a nation.
And there was no desolation. I mean, that the Hebrew word there does not, and what happened during that historical event compared to what happened in AD 70, they don't even compare.
Well, yeah, and I point this out in the article that I posted. When you compare what happened under Antiochus Epiphanes, now let's not try to depreciate how horrible it was. It was an awful period in Israel's history, no question about it. But what you said is absolutely historically valid. It paled in significance to BC 586, can't hold a candle to 70 AD. And here's something that I pointed out in a early program, another blog. Josephus himself points out Jerusalem had been taken 5 times. Now, notice what Josephus says. He mentions how it was captured 3 times, but preserved. Among those 3 was the time of Antiochus Epiphanes.
Right.
And it was destroyed twice by the Babylonians and in 70 AD. So right. Here is, I think Josephus knows his history a little better than Sam Frost does.
Yeah, and probably his Hebrew, desolation. And
he might know his Hebrew a little better than Sam Frost does as well. And so here is this Jewish priestly guy who knows and cites and quotes from Daniel. N.T. Wright acknowledges that over and over again. He says Daniel foretold AD 70. Sam denies that. So it makes you wonder who's more accurate on that application. And Josephus says that the events of Antiochus Epiphanes were nothing like BC 586 or 70 AD. So we got to back up our mind who has the greater authority here.
Right.
And of course, at times, Sam has said, well, preterists just like to appeal to Josephus as if he was inspired. I don't claim he was inspired whatsoever. I don't know of a single preterist that does say he was inspired, but he knew Jewish history better than Sam Frost. And that is the point. He knew the Jewish mentality. And again, as you well pointed out, he knew the Hebrew language better than Sam Frost.
Amen.
So we have really good reason for accepting the testimony of Josephus and rejecting Sam Frost on this. Absolutely. But back to Daniel chapter 12 or 7. He admitted in one post, when the power of the holy people is completely shattered, refers to the, as he calls it, the attack on the Jews under Antiochus. Well, again, completely shattered there does not match what happened under Antiochus. And by the way, I really, really, really like what Brant Petrie in his book, man, it's a good book. I just love the book, Jesus, Tribulation, and the End of Exile. Petrie is a Catholic scholar. How he could write that book and not be a full preterist, it is literally beyond me. But in commenting on Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, the city and the sanctuary shall be destroyed.
Yes.
He makes the observation, this passage is the Achilles heel of the Antiochian view. Well, why is that? Because he says the simple fact of history is the city and the sanctuary were not destroyed.
Right.
Hello. So that kind of blows Sam Frost's view that Daniel 9 is about Antiochus as well.
Right.
So evidently realizing that his argument was giving up too much on when the power of the holy people is completely shattered. And by the way, he's even admitted this. And this is really, really important. I pointed out in one of our internet debates, it says when the power of the holy people was completely shattered, the power of the holy people was Israel's covenant with the Lord. It was Torah, the covenant. But wait a minute. Israel's covenant relationship with God was not terminated under Antiochus Epiphanes. And it wasn't shattered for sure. And as a matter of fact, Sam Frost is on record of saying, as a result of the attacks against the Jews by the forces of Antiochus, there was a resurgence of Torah observance. Wow. Well, that's historically accurate. Here comes the Maccabees. They're not going to cause us or prevent us from keeping law. Everybody is now going to keep the Sabbath like they ought to. They're going to circumcise their children. We're going to keep the law. We're going to be faithful to our God. Hello?
That's so the scepter departs from Judah, not during the Maccabean period, but in AD 70. That's when the kingdom is taken from them. They're cast out of their own kingdom, and it's given to the nation, the church. Pretty clear.
So here is Sam's view on Daniel chapter 12, verse 7, which flies in the face of history. So he changes his view and says, well, that passage can be rendered to read, and there are one or two translations, unfortunately, that do render it that when that when the hand of the persecutor is shattered or is broken. Mm-hmm. Well, I've forgotten the name of the scholars. I can get it for anyone that is interested. But there are several very, very prominent Hebrew scholars who point out this is an awful abuse of the Hebrew language. You have to add to the text. You have to take away from the text. You have to pervert the text in order to render it like that. And like I said, I can get the quote for anyone that wants it. But it's just a categorical rejection of Sam Frost. And it's another illustration of his desperation to change views, change positions when one doesn't work, and then take another one to allow him to escape the force of the text. But it still doesn't work. Absolutely still doesn't work. So
you have the desolation, you have the shattering of the holy people, but then you have that 3.5 years too, where Revelation 11 again connects the two, connects the destruction of Jerusalem and the judgment upon the city where the Lord was crucified with the judgment of the dead and the opening up of God's presence. All right. I mean, the consummation, and he connects those 3.5 years. So the Jews understood the connection.
Absolutely. And there's another point which gets to something we've already touched on briefly, which is extremely critical because of Sam going back to Daniel chapter 12, verse 13. Go your way, you shall rest until the time of the end, until the end of the days, until when you shall arise to your inheritance. And he says, see, that's just got to be resurrection. That's absolutely got to be resurrection. So here is Daniel chapter 12, verse 13, predicting the time of the rewarding of the prophets, right? Mm-hmm. The rewarding the prophets. The passage you just brought up, Revelation chapter 11, it is the time of the dead.
Judgment of the dead.
And the time of the rewarding of the prophets. G.K. Beale sees the connection between the time of Revelation Daniel 11, 12. 15 and Daniel chapter 12.
He sure does.
Now, he won't admit to verse 7. He ignores it.
Everybody does.
Everybody does. N.T. Wright does.
Yeah.
In his massive tome, it's that thick, on the resurrection of the Son of Man. He comments on Daniel chapter 12.
But he knows what the end of the age is.
He knows what the end of the age is.
There you go.
But
isn't he a scholar? I thought no real good scholars teach this.
Yeah, exactly. But he comes to verse 7 and completely, totally ignores it.
Yeah.
Not one word. I mean, maybe he ran out of time in a book that thick. I don't know.
Right.
you would think he could make at least, 1 or 2 paragraphs and say, well, this is really challenging. I don't know how to answer this. And the preterists do, or I don't know, something like that. But so here we have Frost denying initially that the apostles thought about the end of the age in conjunction with the fall of Jerusalem. Now he is saying, well, yes, they really were thinking about the end of the age, but Jesus tells them they're going to see the fall of Jerusalem, but the end is not yet. That is one of the worst eisegetic, quote, explanations of Matthew chapter 24 I believe I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. These things are only the war, the pestilence and the earthquakes and all of that. So when Jesus says, assuredly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things, it's clear what all these things are. It's everything he's just talked about. He's answering their question, and he just does. He talks about his coming. He talks about the end, the Great Commission, the signs, everything. So that's what all these things are. Just like Daniel 12:7,
yeah,
when he says, he wants to know when these things are going to be fulfilled. And he says, these things, all these things will be fulfilled during this 3.5 year period, and when the power of the holy people is completely shattered. He just totally takes that completely out of context and starts chopping everything up. And he's correct when he says this is a very Jewish, the end of the age is very Jewish.
yeah,
Only Matthew and Hebrews, who's also a very Jewish audience. So he doesn't want to tell anyone why, and they don't go to Mark and Luke and ask the obvious question, well, why doesn't Mark and Luke add the end of the age?
right.
Because if that's the end of world history, Don, they screwed up. I mean, that is a huge, huge part of Jesus's teaching that Mark and Luke's audience just didn't get.
Yeah, you're exactly
Um,
right. Yeah,
but it's the end of the Jewish age. And so Mark and Luke, they're not really missing a whole lot there. All right. But Matthew, his audience is Jewish, so he's going to add more parables because Jesus said he's going to speak to the Jews in parables. He's got recapitulation between Matthew 23 and Matthew 25, and it's a chiasm, which Jews understood. So there's no real scholarly interaction, asking the text serious questions when it comes to the end of the age. I didn't see anyway.
well, I agree 100%. And when he said, well, this is all really, really good Jewish stuff, I'm going, yeah, that's exactly right. Why don't you mention that the Jews had the two age concept?
Right.
Why don't you?
N.T. Wright does. He
Yes.
does.
Oh, N.T. Wright does a great job on the two age concept. Emil Schurer in his book, The Life and Times of Jesus, the Messiah. Edersheim admits to it. Other scholars, Jewish background,
Right.
they understood that the Jews had a concept of two ages. Dale Allison Jr. in a little book, very, very hard to find. The end of the ages has come. It's only about this big. I ran onto it. I think I ran onto this book in the late 70s,
Wow.
and I snapped it up because I was in the midst of my studies. And I was struggling with an awful lot of concept. And I thought, well, the end of the ages has come. Wonder what that's about. Man, I flipped through it, and just flipping through it, I'm going, holy cow, this is good. This is one of those that just one quote after another just jumps off the pages at you. But Dale Allison Jr. is absolutely not a preterist. Now, I've
No.
corresponded with with Allison some during down through the years. I submitted my book, "We Shall Meet Him in the Air: The Wedding of the King of Kings," to him, and in a private letter back, he said, "You have done some amazing research," and he said, "This book is what I would call very challenging." And he said, what I love about it is how it destroys the dispensational paradigm. And so I asked him, can I use your whole quote? And he said, no, no. He said, no, he said, this is, that might be a bit much for me. He said, no, you can use the quote about the dispensational aspect. And so, yeah, I know. But nonetheless, here is a scholar that cannot be ever biased, accused of being biased toward the preterist view. What does he say? Two ages. Now, the great question to me, Mike, I have asked this question of one futurist after another in controversy over Matthew 24. They automatically assume, and I well remember the very first time I read Adam Clark on this. of Adam Clark saying this: the King James is a mistranslation. The apostles were not asking about the end of the world; they were asking about the end of the age. And it was like kaboom, minor atom bomb going off. So I ask disputants, futurists, when they bring up Matthew 24 and they say, well, you see in verse 36, Jesus is changing the subject. Now, a little bit of backstory here. Steve Gregg doesn't believe that the apostles asked about the end of time. He doesn't believe they even asked about the end of human history. But guess what he does? He comes to verse 36. And by the way, his argument on that is Jesus had not taught them anything about even going away to this point. So why would they be asking about his return? Okay, that's what Steve Gregg says is the reason for why the apostles were not asking about the coming of Christ at the end of the world. Okay, but then he comes down to verse 36 and says, but of that day and hour. What day and hour? Oh, the end of the world. Wait a minute. Where had Jesus ever said anything about that? You just said he had never taught them about that. So this is some of Steve's problem. But he, again, sorry to get sidetracked.
That's okay. They all blur into one after a while.
Yeah. I ask this question because to me, this is such a simple and yet such a profoundly important question. When Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple, the apostles did, as virtually all scholars agree, link that event with the, quote, end of the age. The great question, therefore, is what age did that temple represent?
Contextually, I mean, it's the easiest. It's just a fundamental hermeneutical question. Just like, well, what end of Matthew 24:14 isn't that connected to the end of the age? Just basic stuff.
Yeah.
What age represents this temple? The old covenant age or the end of world history?
Yeah.
The new covenant?
New covenant
that doesn't make
age?
Any sense?
Which raises another legitimate question, and I'm almost out of time. I can feel my voice closing down on me here. Pardon me. Sam Frost says that the end of the age there has to be what? End of human history, the end of the Christian age. Well, here again, we run into this is a very Jewish thing, according to Sam Frost. He admits this whole discussion. It's very Jewish. So right. What Sam would need to show us is where the Jews believed that the Messianic age, the New Covenant age, number one, was represented by the temple, as you just pointed out. And number two, he needs to show us where the Jews believed that the Messianic age was ever going to end. The Jews did not believe that the Messianic age, what we call the church age, what we call the Christian age, they did not believe it would ever end.
Wow. So did they believe that's like the eternal state on earth or what?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because they believed, and this is easily documented, and in my book on Daniel chapter 12, I have a lot of citations in there. They believed that the age, or quote, this age ended, pardon me, the Jewish narrative was the appearance of Elijah, the Great Tribulation, resurrection, parousia, kingdom. Resurrection is the dividing line between this age and the age to come. Parousia, the dividing line between the two, the judgment, and the Great Tribulation leading up to it, which raises another really, really interesting and significant question, does it not? And I document this again in that book, Daniel, the Resurrection of Daniel, Daniel chapter 12 for fulfilled or future. This is one of those freight trains that came running through my head one day as I'm sitting in my office, you know, as it happens to us, over and over and over again in both the Tanakh and in the New Testament. There is a direct, inseparable, unbreakable bond between the Great Tribulation and the resurrection. It's in Isaiah 26. It's in Jeremiah 30. It's in Hosea 13. It's in Daniel 9. I mean, it's everywhere. It's in Daniel 12.
Right.
Okay, so you have great tribulation occurring immediately before resurrection. This is stunning, folks. Matthew chapter 24. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let the one who reads understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee. Pray that your flight be not in the winter. Pray that the pregnant women would not be with child.
The Sabbath.
Yeah.
Not going Sabbath.
For then, when? In the days of the abomination of desolation, which would be seen by the apostles, which would occur in Judea, for then shall be great tribulation, such as has never been or ever shall be. Great tribulation. And in Matthew 24:31, then he, the Son of Man, shall send forth his angels with the sound of a great trumpet, and they shall gather together the elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. That's a direct citation. G.K. Beale admits it.
Isaiah 27.
Other scholars openly admit it. They make the direct connection. Brent Petrie does in his book. Brent Petrie does a fantastic job of showing the connection between the Great Tribulation and the resurrection. He said this is just a continuing theme throughout the Old Testament. Okay, so Matthew 24:21, Great Tribulation. The apostles would see it. It would be in Judea. Matthew 24:31, the Son of Man sent forth his angels with the sound of the great trumpet. They shall gather together the elect. That's a direct citation of Isaiah 27:13, which is a resurrection passage. Those who are perishing in Egypt and Pathros and Cush shall be gathered together at the sound of the great trumpet, which, by the way, that's the time of Sukkot, the fulfillment of the Feast of Harvest, the Feast of Ingathering.
Exactly.
So what do we have in Matthew 24? Great tribulation, resurrection, and then catch this stunning fact, ladies and gentlemen. Sam Frost now admits, adamantly so, that's his word. That's his word. I now believe, adamantly so, he said in the blog with Jeremiah.
Yeah, I was kind of going, whoa, this is new.
I rocked completely back because Sam has been on record within the last year of saying that this generation refers to this kind of people.
Yeah, Hoikema type stuff. Yeah,
it's not a reference to a time. It's not a temporal reference of any kind.
It's just an evil. It's just describing an evil people throughout
That's right.
world history.
Yeah, whenever it happens to be. But now, in this blog with Jeremiah, he says, I now adamantly affirm that term, this generation, refers to Jesus's contemporary generation.
And he said, you can't get around it.
Yeah.
You can't get around it.
He said, now there are a few alternatives out there, but he said, I've looked at all the scholarship on this and you cannot get around it. Well, thank you, Sam Frost.
Oh, he looked at the scholarship many years ago. This is not something new. This is what bugs me so much. He knew that all along.
Yes. And so he himself admits abomination of desolation, this generation, Jesus's generation. Great tribulation, Jesus's generation. The gathering of the elect, which is the resurrection, Jesus's generation. And then Jesus says, or that statement, verily I say unto you, this generation will by no means pass until all all.
Yeah. Let's touch briefly, though, where he says the end is not yet, because he makes a big deal about
He
this.
does. Go ahead.
Folks, Jesus is giving signs, and he's giving general signs, and he's giving two specific signs that would mark the end. Now, the general signs, the earthquakes, the famines, the wars, the pestilence, these things, these were general signs that he said it's going to mark the whole generation. He says the end is not yet when you see these, but these two specific signs, the gospel being preached in all the world, and then the end of what? The end of the old covenant age. And when you see the army surrounding Jerusalem, you'll know. Those are the two specific signs. And when the disciples and the New Testament authors see these signs, the gospel being preached in all the world, then they were inspired when they were teaching the end is near. Now, to say that before those signs were coming to fulfillment, that's your false prophets, right? He says, don't listen to those. So there's a context for that. And I just want to throw this in real quick. There's a difference between John the Baptist in Matthew 3:7, when he says that the punishment or the wrath that was about to come, in Matthew 16:27, where Jesus says, for the Son of Man is about to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and he will reward each man according to his works. Verily I say to you, that is looking at it from a perspective of Israel waiting for this moment for 2,000 years. The imminence is coming. But the Olivet Discourse, it's connected to these signs. So he's making a differentiation between the signs and what signs that would mark the end and which ones wouldn't. Go ahead, Don.
Well, pardon me. I was literally astounded at one of the arguments that Sam made. He went to Luke chapter 21 and said, see, Jesus warned against people saying the end is drawing near. But he said,
right.
What do we have? According to the preterist, we have all of Jesus's apostles and disciples standing on the street corner saying, the end is drawn near. So they must have been guilty of the very things. He said, well, see, that's to misunderstand the time statements, is what his whole argument was.
Right. The apostles were in line with these modern scholars that turn these time statements into meaningless fooey.
Yeah.
I mean, what does he think?
Well, that is an incredible abuse. Jesus did not say, be wary of people that say the coming of the Lord is at hand. That's not what it says. Luke 21:8 says, many shall come into my name saying, I am he, and the end has come, or the time has come. Do not go after them. It's the Greek word kairos, the appointed time. So these false prophets would say, it's time. Don't go after them until you see the signs, because when you see all these things begin to take place, Matthew chapter 24, verse 32, then know that that is the end, that's the kingdom, that's the parousia, know that it is nigh,
yes,
even at the door. Okay, so here's Jesus in Luke 21:8 condemning premature declarations of the nearness of the end. So what do we find in Peter, passage you mentioned a few moments ago? 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 5. Peter said, Christ was ready, from the Greek word hetoimos, meaning not only morally prepared, but temporally ready to judge the living and the dead. Alfred's Greek Testament, as a matter of fact, says the Greek reader of this verse would understand the imminent judge. And of course, Sam Frost says, no, Alfred's is wrong. Just wrong.
Of course.
Then, okay, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 5, Christ was ready to judge, now watch, the living and the dead. Verse 7.
The creedal statement.
The creedal statements, that's right. Verse 7, the end of all things has come near. Perfect tense. It has come. Verse 17. Now remember, Jesus said, don't believe anybody that says the time has come.
Right.
Until you see the signs. Peter, living later in that generation, 30 years almost, has seen the signs. He knows, I believe, he's giving us an indication that the end of the millennium is near, because at the end of the millennium, Satan would be loose for a little season to go out and make war with the saints. Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 9, beware, for your adversary, the devil, walks about as a raging lion,
right,
seeking whom he may devour. I think that's Peter's way of saying, folks, Satan's been loose. The time is here.
right.
So anyway, Peter has seen the signs. He's living in the time when the signs have been fulfilled. Most assuredly, the Great Commission has been fulfilled, because he's writing after Paul said the gospel has been preached to every creature under heaven, which Sam Frost denies.
Right.
And then Peter says, the time, ho kairos, appointed time, the very word that Jesus warned about not believing false prophets. Okay.
Right.
When they would say the end has come. Peter's using it in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 7, the appointed time for the judgment, ho krino, the judgment, not a judgment, not simply judgment, the appointed
judgment.
time for the judgment has come. Now, in 1 Peter 4, verse 17, Peter uses what is known as the anaphoric article. The anaphoric article, according to Daniel Wallace in his Beyond the Basics of Greek Grammar, says the anaphoric article is the most common use it's the preponderant use of the definite article in all of the Greek Testament. What is an anaphoric article? Well, you have an author, a speaker, writer, whatever, who introduces a subject. Later on in his discussion, he wants to refer back to that subject. So he uses the definite article. Okay. So what do we find in verse 5? We have the subject introduced of the judgment of the living and the dead. Verse 17, we find the definite article, the anaphoric article, which is telling us that Peter is saying, I'm talking about the judgment of the living and the dead, and the time has come. Now, according to Sam Frost, evidently Peter was one of those false prophets that Jesus warned against.
No, he was just a scholar, a modern scholar that knew near didn't really mean near. That isn't what he was trying to say, Don.
I suppose I just have a hard time accepting that nonsense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here we have Sam Frost trying to pit the Bible, the biblical apostles, for crying out loud,
I know,
against the false teachers and against Jesus himself. And of course, it gets back to the issue. Had the Holy Spirit wanted to communicate that the appointed time for the judgment of the living and the dead, the end of all things, had he wanted to communicate, what other words would he have used?
right.
Now, I made this comment recently. Sam Frost recently made the boast, preterists have boxed themselves into this corner. They cannot allow for any alternate view of these time words. They just can't do it. Sam Frost is the one that has painted himself into an inescapable corner that is linguistically laughable. And here's what I mean. On Facebook, I have it in my files. I asked Sam Frost, is there any eschatological text in the entire New Testament? Should have asked him about the Old, but I didn't. But is there any eschatological text in the New Testament with which there is an objective statement of temporal imminence, even one? And he wrote back and said, not one.
Not even in a non-eschatological context?
No, that's the kicker here. And this is what I pointed out in my response. Sam Frost says there no eschatological text can have a statement of imminence with it. If it's got the time words with it, they don't mean time. In non-eschatological texts, those same words in the same Greek tenses can most assuredly mean temporal imminence. Now, folks, if you want to talk about a twisted, illegitimate hermeneutic, that's it. That is a farce when it comes to linguistics. There's not a book on hermeneutic ever written that would accept that argument. There's not a Greek scholar. I don't believe you could find a Greek scholar to agree with that kind of a hermeneutic.
Right.
But that's Sam Frost, brand new hermeneutic. I even asked him, I challenged him, cite me one scholarly source, cite me one hermeneutical source that agrees with your principle on this. Of course, he didn't even try, even though I asked him 5 or 6 times in 5 or 6 different posts. He completely and totally ignored it. And then he disappeared from the conversation.
Wow. Well, it's funny. He says preterism, full preterism is going to go nowhere because he knows the scholars. And, I mean, if he knows the scholars and what the scholars are saying, even overseas, then you better listen to Sam. But the fact of the matter is, guys, preterism is exploding. Partial preterism is exploding because people like the hermeneutic. Yes. They've been taught all this garbage before. And the ones that have been trained in hermeneutics, when they see this, and then it inevitably leads to full preterism. And Sam knows that. That's why he says Gentry's inconsistent. DeMar is inconsistent. Well, if they're inconsistent, if they were consistent, what would happen, Sam?
Yeah.
Oh, they'd be full preterists. Okay, thank you. Yeah. I mean, it's just that simple. Real quickly, Jeremiah had a problem with the end of the age in Matthew 28, 18 through 20, and the Great Commission there. Don, I want to get your thoughts on this because we can tie this in maybe to Kim Burgess and maybe Gary DeMar, because I think Gary DeMar has still maybe hinted that this is kind of a post AD 70, post millennialism type deal. But Jeremiah says, he says, what is he? He says he's offended. He's offended that the Great Commission of Revelation 22, 2, and 17, he says that's obscure. And he says he's offended that we would take Matthew 28 as fulfilled. Well, I don't care if he's offended. I want to know what the passage says. And there's nothing obscure about the evangelism taking place in Revelation 22. Because of all of his partial preterist friends should be telling him that. But
that's right.
Don, the big thing here is he says, well, Christ is with me, and that's a precious promise. And you helped me with this a long time ago. When we go to Mark 16, and we know that there's some textual issues with the end of Mark 16, but we can set that aside because whoever put it there, they were interpreting the end of Matthew in such a way. So in Mark 16, it ends in verse 20 that Christ would be with them through doing these miracles.
Yes.
And we know in Acts that the people said of Jesus, or the Gospels, or was it Acts? I can't remember. We know that God is with him because of the miracles that he does. So this is not talking about just Jesus being with us in a general sense through the Holy Spirit comforting us. Right. This is a promise to the apostles to give them power and boldness and the charismata to fulfill the Great Commission before the end of the Old Covenant age. And that is what this with them means. And so he's not with us today. Jeremiah, are you speaking in tongues?
Right.
Are you prophesying? No, you're not. And I think this is the same problem for Kim Burgess. I think it's the same problem for anyone that is trying to marry full preterism with postmillennialism and taking this end of the age as a different end of the age and Great Commission that is in Matthew 24 and that is in Matthew 13. Go ahead.
No, I think you're spot on. And that's what I saw years and years and years ago. And another passage that bears, to me, extremely powerful weight and testimony and confirmation of this. In Acts chapter 14, when Paul was at Lystra, I believe it was, it says the Lord was with him and bore witness to him, performing many signs, miracles, and wonders, through them. Okay, so here's Paul preaching the gospel, Mark 16, 15, 16. How was God bearing witness with them? By granting that miracles and signs be done by them. So that's a perfect commentary on not only Mark 16, 15, and 16, but on Matthew chapter 28, 18 to 20. And let's not forget this. Matthew chapter 28, 18 to 20, I am with you to the end of the age. That end of the age is the same Greek term, suntelia, to aeonion.
Yes, it is.
I think I got my suffixes wrong there, but nonetheless, as found in Matthew 13, three times, and in Matthew chapter 24. Well, we should know what the end of the age was in Matthew 24, because it's the end of the age that the apostles tied to the destruction of Jerusalem. So the
What
question,
would you say? What would you say? What would be your response to the postmillennialist who says, well, there's a distinction here because the Great Commission in Matthew 24, Matthew 10, Matthew 13, they're just bearing witness. But here in Matthew 28, they're discipling the nations.
Well, if you're going to draw a distinction between discipling, then you've got to be able to prove that Acts chapter 14, for instance, is totally different from Mark 16, 15, and 16. Because Paul was preaching the gospel in Acts chapter 14, was he not? He was converting people in Acts chapter 14, and it was being done through the miraculous power of the Holy Spirit that God was granting him in fulfillment of Mark 16, 15 to 20.
Exactly. As far as discipling, though, I mean, Paul planted churches. He'd go to the synagogues first, to the Jew and to the Gentile, and the believing Greeks and the God-fearers. And then he would plant a church there, and obviously he discipled them.
Obviously.
So if Paul preached the gospel throughout all the nations in the Roman Empire before the end of the Old Covenant age, if you plant a church and you're writing people and you're sending apostles and your servants to go disciple them, the nations were discipled. This doesn't have to mean every nation on the planet is going to be Christianized right before the end of world history. I think that's just an abuse of this passage. And if you're reading the Gospel of Matthew, whether it's in the first century or today, why would you think that the end of the age in Matthew 13 and Matthew 24 and Matthew 28, like one of them would be different than the other one? That there's just no rhyme or reason. And the burden of proof would be upon Jesus or Matthew to make it clear, oh, but this one is referring to the end of world history.
And that has always
not that delineation.
That has always struck me as you know, I call it the argumentum ad desperatum, when people, they start trying to find distinctions that textually, grammatically, you just go, where do you find such a distinction? It's just like Sam Frost on Daniel chapter 12, 1 and 2. Daniel chapter 12, at that time there shall be great tribulation, such as has never been since there was a nation up to that time. Oh, verse 2, resurrection at the end of time. So verse 1, time of Antiochus, 2nd century BC. Verse 2, end of time. That's putting so far a period of 2,200 years in the period at the end of verse 1.
Right.
Now, what's the justification for that? That's why I say this is argumentum ad desperatum. The only way that anyone would even try to do that, and in my debate with David Hester, one of my debates with him, he did the identical thing. Of course, David Hester, in my debate with him, changed his position on Daniel 12 3 times during the debate. So, didn't bother him a bit. But again, when people's preconceived ideas, or in this case, Sam Frost's make it up as I go along theology, and I'll change today. If somebody nails me on it, I'll change it tomorrow. That's exactly what's happening. Sam Frost is casting around, trying to find something, anything whatsoever, that he can throw against covenant eschatology. And when he's nailed on it over and over and over again, he has no problem whatsoever of changing. Now, his explanation to me about that has been, well, that's what scholars do.
Yeah.
We throw out hypotheses and we test them. And if they don't work, then we try another hypothesis. Well, then what's the problem, Sam? Those of us who are full preterists are throwing out the hypothesis of full preterism. Why don't you prove it wrong? But he
Exactly.
can't.
All right. One last thing,
Okay.
because your voice is fading and we've been going long. You had to deal with this in the Joel McDermott debate. And of course, Sam and Jason were trying to tutor him. And you were stunned, and I was stunned as I was listening to the debate. Sam actually says that Abraham was not looking. He was actually looking to the land in the future when it would be glorified. This physical dirt would somehow be glorified in a new heaven and new earth. Don, I don't know what version of Hebrews he has, but it's really clear that Abraham was looking to a heavenly country, and all of the things in Hebrews that are better, that are true, are always spiritual.
That's
Every
exactly
single
right.
one of them. And the Jew would never separate resurrection from the land, and or the city or Jerusalem. So in Hebrews 13:14, when he says that that they were not looking for a city here on earth, an abiding or eternal city here on earth, they were looking for one that was about to come. So he makes it clear it's not a physical city, and he makes it clear when it was going to come. And so you can't have a physical city or a spiritual city resting on a physical dirt or land. You can't do that. So the author is consistently saying all these new covenant better things, true things, are spiritual. They're heavenly. They're not the physical dirt.
As I heard Sam explaining, well, Abraham didn't want the dirt that he was standing on because it was so corrupt and immoral and cruel and unjust. He wanted that same dirt, only after it had been purified and glorified, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like you, Mike. I was sitting there watching it, sitting there listening, and I'm going, how could anybody be so bold as to overtly pervert what Hebrews chapter 11 to 16 says?
Yeah.
He looked for a city and a country whose builder and maker is God. He looked for a heavenly country. Well, last I looked, I don't think there's dirt in heaven, and I don't think the land of Canaan is the dirt that is described as the heavenly country. So it's just another example of that, of Sam trying to. Well, I'm reminded of Romans chapter 16, where Paul warned against those who, with fair speeches, fair words, and fair speeches, deceive the people. Yeah. He goes through a text, he completely alters what it actually says, and says, "See, preterists are wrong. They're flying right in the face of what this text says when he hadn't even got the text even close to right."
Well, even Paul says in Colossians, he says, "Do not set your mind on things of the land," as you know, some translations earth, but I think it's "gi" there, and very well can be translated as land. And that's the whole context. Don't go back into the elements of Judaism. So even Paul is like, no, our hope is heavenly. It's not this dirt. It's not this land. And that was just grievous. And this ties in, maybe we can conclude with this. Jeremiah says of preterists, he says, how do I comfort people who are dying? This is it? I find this so troubling. And, we were talking about this before the show, Don. You've been doing this longer than me, but over the last 30 years, I've never met anyone that was dying, that was a full preterist, that said, "Oh man, I got to rethink this because, I'm disillusioned. I mean, my hope is that, the trees are going to grow taller someday and mosquitoes are going to stop biting. And that's really, I'm on my deathbed, and that's really what I'm thinking about
And
right now.
instead of saying, man, I got to go to heaven, for crying out
Yeah.
loud.
Yeah. I mean, they're excited, man.
Oh
They
yeah.
are
Oh
excited. I
yeah.
mean, Pastor Curtis had a friend that passed away not too long ago, and he said he was so excited, man, to go and be in God's presence even more,
Yeah.
so than he could experience here in the physical realm. And if that's not your hope, if Christ's presence isn't your hope, and his, I mean, I don't know what to tell you.
Well,
I mean,
I'm, and of course that's a position of N.T. Wright as well, who believes that, you know, we've got to have a renovated earth. We've got to have friendly animals and non-invasive bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes. I've never been able to grasp the concept that heaven is okay, but it's not really all that big of a thing.
yeah,
Uh,
I don't
but
know.
Hebrews chapter 6 says that our hope enters into that which is within the veil,
Hmm.
and it is an anchor of the soul. But they want to tell us, well, okay, if when we die, if we go to heaven, that's all fine and good. So I guess we can spend 1 million or 2 years there. But man, we're going to spend our time wishing and hoping and praying the Lord would take us out of that place and bring us back to this earth.
Ugh.
Seriously, I mean, uh,
Yeah.
it's just unfathomable that kind of mentality, and you can deny it all you want to, but that's an earthy, materialistic kind of, quote, almost seems paradoxical to say it, but of spirituality.
Right.
That is a materialistic theology and
Yeah. Paul said
eschatology.
we do not set our hope on things which can be seen,
Yeah.
whether they're the old covenant things or just looking out. I mean, this is not our hope. This is not,
Yeah.
God's presence is the climax of redemptive history. And
How
if that's
any
not enough for you, either here or when you die, you've got a totally different hope than what scripture
Absolutely.
lays out.
And why would it be necessary to be on a round globe of dirt and grass and water and everything? And believe you me, I love nature. Absolutely love nature. I love to be in the woods and all that kind of stuff. But why would being here be better than being there? What is there about here that's better than there? Now,
No,
I've never had a futurist ever explain that to me, and yet they say, well, it's the restoration of Eden. Uh, no, I'm sorry. You don't really believe in the restoration of Eden. It's kind of like in my debate with Joel McDermott. He kept talking about no marriage, no giving in marriage, and you preterists ought to get divorced, if you really believe the Bible and what have you. And I had asked him, do you believe that the new heaven and new earth is the restoration of Eden? He said, well, yeah. And I said, well, in Eden before sin, God said, be fruitful and be multiply. So evidently we're going to have kids in the new heaven and new earth, but no marriage, according to your doctrine. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it when he got back up. And you could tell it rattled him. He said, I don't remember ever saying that Adam and Eve were actually married.
that was his counter, huh?
that was his answer. Yeah.
Woo.
He said, well, maybe I did at some point, but I don't remember ever saying that. So you're willing to say that Adam and Eve were not married, but they were supposed to have kids. Oh, there's a new theology, a new Christian theology. Is that a new post-millennial theology?
Exactly.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, they just kind of make some stuff up on the spot.
That,
Well, I think we covered pretty much. I mean, John 6,
yeah.
Jeremiah is really concerned about Satan. Oh boy, Satan.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, but I
Well,
think we
there's
covered
some
enough.
other issues that we could cover, but my voice feels terrible,
I hear you.
and it's I'll go back over my notes and what have you. We might do one other shorter program in order to cover Matthew chapter 13 and tie it in with the Olivet Discourse and, obviously the book of Revelation. So, but anyway, we'll give that some thought. So anyway, folks, well, want to thank you for joining us. I've enjoyed this a great deal. I'm sorry my voice just gives out. It's still a hangover from the COVID nonsense and the two respiratory infections I've had since then. But anyway, thanks so much for joining us. And I'm pretty sure we'll do this again sometime in the not too distant future. So good night and God bless.
Take care.